Welcome to the first in our series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. In today's lecture, The New World on the Eve of Contact, I'd like you to be able to answer a number of key questions by the time you get to the last slide. For example, you should know how Native Americans got to the Americas. You also should have some understanding of the native population of the Americas before contact with Europeans. And you also should know how geography helps to determine culture of native peoples. That said, the material in this lecture goes beyond these simple questions, and so I'd like you to take note on whatever you think is important, something that's going to help you to better understand the New World on the eve of contact. That said, I'd like you to also be aware that the material covered in these lectures is just as important as material that we covered during our class time. So please take good notes. If you have questions, please raise them, either in class or through an email to me, whatever. I want to make sure that these lectures help you to better understand the material that we are covering this semester. So that said, let's get to our first lecture on the New World on the Eve of Contact. This photograph depicts Columbus's discovery of America. And this is where most U.S. history courses used to begin. The idea was that America couldn't exist until Christopher Columbus, quote-unquote, discovered it, when he landed in the Western Hemisphere in October of 1492. The problem is that if you start the story here, you miss out on more than half of the story. Here's one way to dramatize it. One historian argues that if you picture all of human history in the Western Hemisphere as a clock, then Christopher Columbus makes landfall sometime around 11:57 p.m. Or, to put it another way, Europeans have been in the Americas for about 3 minutes. So, what happened in the Americas before 1492? Well, before 1492, there were more than 2,000 different cultures in North America alone. Here are just a few. The Lakota, for example, were a people that lived on the Great Plains. The Cherokee were a people that lived in what is now the U.S. Southeast, the southeastern United States. The Navajo lived in what's now the southwestern part of the United States. And the Mohawk lived in New York and much of the northeastern part of the United States. And so on and so forth. Each of these cultures had a different language. Each of them had a different religion. In short, each of these peoples was as different from one another as an English person is from a Russian. To generalize about them is impossible. Still, in the interest of time, we're going to try. If we're going to start at the very beginning, we need to ask one fundamental question. How did native peoples get to the Americas? There are many possible theories. Over time, some hypothesized that native peoples were descendants of very early migrants from Europe to the Americas. Others argued that native peoples had migrated to the Americas from Asia. And if you asked native peoples themselves, they would argue that they've always been here. One of the stories that we're going to encounter in class is one that I like to call The World on the Turtle's Back. That's a story from the Iroquois. And once again, this story hypothesizes that native peoples have always been here, that this is where they were created. So, what does the historical record say? Well, the genetic record shows a connection between Native Americans and Asian peoples. We can see this in a number of physical characteristics, including straight black hair, their skin color, and their sparse facial and body hair. But if we accept that Native Americans are genetically connected to Asian peoples, we have to ask the next question. How did they get here? Anthropologists have gone back a very long time to try to answer this question. In fact, they went back more than 80,000 years to the last ice age, known as the Wisconsin period. This period lasted from about 80,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. During the Ice Age, much of the world's water was tied up in glaciers that covered much of the northern hemisphere. This may have caused water levels in the world's oceans to drop as much as 150 feet. That would have left the Bering Strait that now separates Russia from Alaska as dry land. It may have been as much as 1,000 miles long, in fact. Moreover, it is suspected that instead of being covered in ice and snow, this land that we now call Beringia would have had grasslands and might have drawn great migratory animals. Thus, the theory is that Asian peoples migrated across Beringia from Asia to North America sometime before 12,000 years ago. They kept moving, and in fact, some argue that they reached the tip of South America by 11,000 years ago. From then on, they continued to expand their populations. In fact, it is theorized that the total population of the Western Hemisphere was between 80 million and 100 million on the eve of contact with Europe. The population of North America alone was thought to be about 4.5 million people. But while these peoples had common ancestors, they evolved into very different cultures. As I said earlier, there were about 2,000 cultures in the Americas by 1492. These cultures depended heavily upon geography. The Great Plains, for example, were dominated by buffalo hunting tribes, like the Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne. But not all Plains peoples lived this way. The Hidatsas, the Mandan, and the Pawnee practiced some agriculture, especially in their villages that were established along rivers and streams. In the Northeast, there were peoples who lived in semi-permanent villages. The Iroquois, for example, would occupy their villages for 10 to 20 years before moving on. Some of the other tribes would live near the coast in the summer, where they would plant fields of corn, squash, and beans. Then after harvest, they would move further inland, where they were protected from the cold and the snow. So in other words, these peoples both practiced mixed agriculture and hunting. Meanwhile, in the southeast, tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek practiced a mixed economy that included farming as well as hunting and gathering. In other areas, such as the Southwest, peoples like the Pueblo were able to live in permanent villages, where they could practice agriculture. But not everyone in the Southwest practiced agriculture. In fact, some survived by raiding the Pueblos. In other words, they would steal food and supplies from the Pueblos. That was their economy. They included the Navajo and the Apache. While the native peoples of the Americas had unique cultures, they did have some things in common. For one thing, they did not practice the domestication of animals, at least not the domestication of large animals, such as horses, cattle, and oxen. They did domesticate dogs, but again, there were no large mammals that were being kept as domesticated animals. Nor did they develop large sailing ships. Most native peoples either traveled on foot, or if they had to travel across the water, they often did so in small canoes, or dugouts. So again, they didn't have the large sailing ships that Europeans had. Nor did they ever develop the technology of the wheel. Nor did they develop metallurgy. They only used copper. In other words, they only used metals that were soft enough that they could be, essentially could be worked without smelting, without melting, without, mixing metals together. Only those things that they could pound out, such as copper. Again, copper is a relatively soft metal, and so therefore you can work copper without actually melting it. Like all peoples, the native peoples of the Americas had a rich spiritual life. And while it's, again, very difficult to generalize about these religions, in other words, they all had very different gods, they had very different stories, they had very different beliefs, we can make some generalizations. One of those generalizations is that native religions centered on the natural world. Most native cultures, in fact, saw little difference between animals and humans. In fact, many native creation stories showed humans and animals working together for their mutual survival. This is markedly different from the spiritual world of Europeans. It is also very different from the attitudes of most Westerners today. What I hope you learn from this lecture is that the Americas were inhabited by millions of people and thousands of cultural groups well before Christopher Columbus made landfall in 1492. I hope you also can see how different native cultures were from the Europeans who are on their way. These differences are going to create a climate of conflict that will shape American history. Thank you very much.